All right, good evening, guys. This is Dr. Long, and it is November 6, 2020, the election recount edition. So, I want to talk a little bit about strategy and alignment, in this case, in the public sector. So, it may be that you find yourself acting in a public service capacity or in an advisory capacity to a government or a nonprofit. And you will end up being an advocate for the use of a research orientation to support the decision making of how that organization or government may end up providing a service to the public or to their clientele. Uh, to another extent, the research can also help in the for-profit area, but I really want to concentrate more on strategy making with the use of research as it applies to public service. And this would be typical of an advisor who is supporting public administration. So this is really an exploration of the research life cycle and what I want to do is talk about how that life cycle of research might end up being managed. And I'm going to be talking about different methods and where they fit in that life cycle, depending on how mature the situation is that you're advising, where you find yourself in that life cycle. And it turns out that each one of these methods is really geared towards answering a particular kind of question that you find at different stages in the making of public policy. And that the assumptions of one method may very well end up being the focus of research of another method. And so, thought about broadly, sometimes you are just interested in understanding what's going on in the situation in the world. Like, there's something going on in the world and I don't know where to begin, so I'm going to begin by trying to develop understanding. Then there are times when I actually understand what's going on. I already have a rich description of the world, and so now I want to move on to analyzing that data in some way to figure out what's going on at the detailed level, to figure out what are the important facts. So if I have some understanding, what are the most important drivers of that situation? What are the key performance parameters, we might say? So I'm going to do some analysis to come up with that kind of understanding. I may also be analyzing between different courses of action to investigate which one has more utility than another. Or I may be looking at a more detailed implementation plan for a particular solution. So the analysis might get me in the ballpark of what should work, but solution making is really going another level deeper to figure out if this thing is really feasible in the world, and can I create a sustainable solution for long-term payoff. Or it may be that I've already implemented a solution, and now what I want to do is find out how well it's actually performing. Because when I first designed the solution, I had some ideas about how it should perform on the basis of the analysis, but now that I've implemented it, I want to now assess it and see how it's working. So, depending on how mature your understanding of the world is, you might find yourself in one of those four areas, and you're going to ask different kinds of questions. So, trying to understand it, you might just say, "Hey, what's going on? Who are the actors and agents and forces in the ecosystem or in the analysis? What's important about it, and what are the drivers of change? And what leads to success? What are the causal factors?" under solutions, that what things would probably work to improve the situation in the way that I want to improve it. And then the questions up here tend to be, how well are we doing? Are we achieving the effects that we thought we'd see, or is there a statistically different result coming in that needs to inform our next round of decision making? So, depending on where you are in this, what I think of as the life cycle, research methods can be chosen to help you answer the particular kind of question that's next. So, when we think about problem solving, we don't want to prematurely jump in and start solving the problem, with solutions until we're really sure that we understand what's going on and that we've analyzed it deeply and make sure that we're focused on the most important things. So before we get to problem solving, we probably want to do problem framing first. And that is understanding the nature of the problem and setting up the conditions to solve it in the usual way with a reliable method. But before we do that, we want to make sure that we've scanned the environment first and we do problem finding. So of all the things that are happening in the world, there are many problems. There's no shortage of problems. So we want to make sure that we find the right one to work on. So when we're out here, we might want to pick that problem instead of this problem, instead of that problem. So we want to problem find the most important one that we can tackle, and then we want to understand it enough so that we can see what kind of a problem it is and frame it so that we can then pick a method that would solve it. So that's why it's important to know where you are in the life cycle of understanding the world so that you're focusing on answering the next most important question. You don't want to be prematurely going after solutions when what you should really be doing is just trying to understand what's going on. So let's start from the beginning and say, look, we've got a complex world. It's not static. It's the world that we're in, and it's always moving. So we have some situation in the world, and we've decided to work on that bounded space right in here, a particular problem. And we can say, well, is that a problem or an opportunity that we're seeing? Or is it some combination of both? And now what we're doing is trying to understand what's going on so that we can frame the problem. Well, the kinds of methods, especially in public administration, that help us understand that might be something like, well, let me start with a case study that looks at this problem in the world from many different angles and uses different kinds of, maybe a mixed methods approach to gathering data that's appropriate for that locality, and try to come up with a rich description of the world, of the actors, the agents, the forces, the structures, maybe an ecosystem approach that now serves as a baseline from which all future maybe analysis, solutions, and assessments can proceed. So that gives us a baseline understanding of what's going on here. But we may also be interested in not just this external look, from the outside in, but we might want to say, hey, let me take a phenomenological approach and try to understand what's going on from inside of the problem area. So one of the traditional problems with traditional research is that when you set up an area to research and you strictly bound it, and you've got people involved in there, living their lives and doing their thing, and here you are, this outside observer, trying to figure out what's going on, you can only observe and report on what you can see, and you're bringing with you all of your own understandings and questions and your background, and unless you're very careful in how you set up your research. So phenomenology has emerged as a research technique that concentrates on the lived experience of people inside of that bubble to understand the world through their eyes so that we can see how the programs and policies and actions in the world are being interpreted and felt by the people who are affected by this. So, phenomenology differs from a case study in which we are concentrating on the lived experience of people inside the bubble. On the other side of this thing, we might have a very detailed understanding of all the forces and actors and agents and whatnot, and we think we have an understanding in the form of a hypothesis about how that world really works, and we're going to do a tightly controlled experiment to test one or more variables to determine if we can prove causality about how the work is going, so that we can, instead of this iceberg approach where we only understand the surface, we're using hypothesis testing to deepen our understanding of all the causal factors down at the root level that are triggering actions in the world. So all of these methods, hypothesis testing, case study, and phenomenology, are ways that we can get after this challenge of understanding what's going on in the world. There's another method out there called survey research, which is, it would not be unusual to see the discipline of survey research being used in support of the data gathering techniques of these other methods. So in some ways, survey research is not a separate discipline, but it is such a well-refined and understood method of how to construct a survey, how to sample properly, how to word it in a neutral way, how to analyze the data, how to ask an economical number of questions to be able to gain insights into some key variables. So there's a whole art and science that's been developed around the discipline of survey research, which is often employed in support of these other ways of gathering data about the world. Well, once we've understood that world sufficiently, we're now ready to move into analysis, the so what. What is it that we can learn from all this data that we've gathered and find out what are the important features of it? What are the important issues? What are the criteria we can use to judge between courses of action? How do we calibrate our instruments to get the right level of fidelity to make the analysis? What are the standards of judgment we're going to use? How do we validate our instrument? How do we validate the inspection regime that's allowing us to do the analysis? All of those things are now important parts of any of these other methods. We might do something like a cost-benefit analysis. Now that we understand how the world works and we have some kind of policy proposal, we might say, well, if we adopted policy A, what would be the costs of it and what would be the benefits? So we're starting to try to understand how value is created and understood. We might do that through the lens of all these people that are affected by it, and we say, maybe that came out of phenomenology. Now that we understand how they value things, we might be able to put some numerical values on what they see as costs, not just what the dollars say, but what do they think are the costs, and how much do they value the different benefits that come from different policy proposals. So a cost-benefit analysis is really just trying to understand that, like risk-reward payoffs as well of individual policies. And typically in terms of resources, but not necessarily restricted to that. Policy analysis is close to that, although it may include some elements of analysis that are beyond the pure quantitative that you often see in cost-benefit. This looks at a more well-rounded set of integrated payoffs and benefits and winners and losers. It might consider stakeholders, interest groups, the perception of outsiders, all that stuff. So policy analysis tends to be a little broader, not quite so quantitative maybe as a cost benefit, but it's looking at second and third order effects too, and in some cases that might be qualitative. We might also be analyzing for feasibility, so that if we had a policy proposal and we figured out, well, we might have some kind of organization set up that could implement that policy in some way, and that there would be certain costs and manpower and infrastructure and operations, and all of those things are some of the operating costs, and we think maybe there's some payoffs. We can think about funding. Is this the kind of business or organization or program that looks like it could be sustained and self-sustaining over time and achieve the benefits that we might have identified in a cost-benefit analysis? And so a feasibility study helps us get a little more practical orientation, which says, could I actually implement the policy that I have been proposing? Sometimes the choices that come out of an area are so rich with opportunities to do things that we might have to resort to the quantitative methods that you find in operations research in order to really begin to understand the interplay of many variables, constraints, limitations, rewards, punishments, all that. Operations research gives us some quantitative techniques that allow us to express complex operations in interesting and valuable ways. So that turns out to be a deep method with many different supporting methods. In the same way that survey research can help us answer questions in these other areas, operations research has a whole series of quantitative tools like neural networks, expert systems, linear programming, genetic algorithms, machine learning, trade-off analysis, trade space. All of these things are a whole family of techniques that can be used to do some quantitative analysis. Well, once we've conducted that analysis and we have a deeper understanding of this environment that we're in, we might then start doing some research to investigate different kinds of solution packages. And we might then employ the techniques of program design as a way to start linking groups of policies together in a feasible way, supported maybe by some quantitative analysis. And so we might come up with package A, B, and C in a program with multiple policies. And we might, because of the complexity of it, we might do it in a pilot phase, an initial phase, and then a mature phase, or we might say, let me just get a good solution, and then if that works, add better, and so good, better, best, as we begin to scale and we begin to learn and grow. So program design takes into account all of the complexities that came out of our analysis, and then some complexity in how we implement large-scale programs in the world into maybe a phased approach, or there's elements of project management in that as well. So once we've designed a program, it's because we think this bundle of activities and programs and policies and organizations and services that we're going to provide should be able to achieve some kind of payoff in terms of numbers or qualitative payoffs as may be seen by the participants or the members of that society. So we have some expectations about what it should perform and how it should do. But now when we get into the assessment phase, and we've let it run for a while, we might then conduct the principles of program evaluation and use that method to look back to see if that program as designed and then program as implemented is actually achieving the effects that we established, and gives us a research basis for deciding to add to it or to modify it or to cancel the program based on the feedback that we get. So sort of to summarize that little bit then, each of these stages in the life cycle research management, we're building on previous pieces of research in a living, growing, dynamic way. The kinds of research that we practically do in the world are not in isolation, but they are grounded in some living portion of the world with real people involved, which is why phenomenology matters. So it may very well be then that as we understand this situation and we framed out the problem, we can then think about a strategy to make the improvements. That strategy is going to be the basis of that, what eventually becomes our program design. But we can think about that strategy as a way to respond to that kind of problem frame. And that strategy leads us to develop a detailed plan for implementation. And quite often, the method that we have chosen to do our data gathering and our analysis will help us make that connection between a broad vision of strategy and a specific detailed plan. You might think of this in terms of ends, ways, and means, that the ends, these strategic visions, strategic plans, help us define the ends that we are interested in. And then the method that we chose to do the analysis and to come up with the solution and to validate the possible solution and how we implement it, maybe as a result of the feasibility plan. That becomes the ways that we achieve things. And then once we put the resources into it, time, people, money, capital, infrastructure, that becomes the means by which we take the action and put it to work in the world so that we can achieve results. And then that's where the program evaluation and the assessment comes in to help us then. Now, if we've invested in the ability to learn, like if we care about the results, we can then use that as a feedback loop to say, did we really frame it right? Did we have a good strategy in retrospect? Did we pick the right method? Was our plan pretty good? Did we have the right ways of getting things done? Did we resource it properly? Was the action that we put into play efficient and effective and honorable and so forth? And are the results typical, and do we have confidence in that? Well, if you want to actually learn, you have to invest in the data gathering, and this is where having that research orientation says that we care about this golden thread that links together our initial understandings and problem framing all the way to getting results, and then most importantly, conducting the learning and assessment to see how we can get better in the future. If we don't invest in that kind of research orientation that is treats these with respect and care, then all we get are results, but we don't know what to attribute those results to because we haven't studied the things that have come before, and then our possibility of learning is reduced to just knee-jerk reactions. So we don't want to do that. So when we adopt a research mindset to improve operations in the world, what we're really doing is getting like the scholar practitioner approach, that we're using the best of both theory and practice, the what we should do and then the how we did it, that we're taking both of those and trying to learn our way to improvement. That's sort of the principles of action learning and participatory action research. So when you take a look at a research orientation in the public administration space, we got to recognize that this world that we started with back here, that thing is continuously moving. It's not waiting for us to just get done with our ivory tower theories. It's changing while we're conducting the research. So it's always moving, and our interest is in improving the current operations. Like we may have had programs already in play, and we're not satisfied that they're the best they can be. So even though they may be okay, or even very good, we're always interested in improving. And because the world is changing at a certain rate, we have to conduct research about the world as it changes, so we know what it is that we should be adapting to. And we're searching into the solution space to find new ways and new understandings and new methods of improvement. So we're always on the lookout. And then we're having to make choices between reasonable courses of action because we can't do them all. And then we want to make sure that we're being sensible about how we scope our problems so that we're not biting off more than we can chew, but that we're taking on problems that are significant, but within the limits of our resources and our skill sets. And in that way, we can continue to adapt and learn and respond to a world that's always changing. So this life cycle approach to research management is not just conducting research to gain some theoretical understanding of the world one time, but it's really part of an ongoing commitment of operations where we try to maybe detect what's going on in the world, understand it, decide where we are and what to do about it, and make a plan to deliver, and then actually deliver our solutions or conduct our research, and then assess those results that we got. So we're always engaged in these ongoing cycles of detect, decide, deliver, and assess. So now I want to talk a little bit about those methods that we're using and uh, talk about the importance of our models. Now that we've laid out that framework, I want to spend a little more time on the important idea of the analytical lens that we are using to conduct our analysis, regardless of whether we were in the understand, analyze, solution finding, or assessment phase. In every one of those research methods that we looked at, the method itself is based on a model or a theory or a process about how the world works. And those models can come from academic theory, or they may come from the practical application of a profession and the way it does work in the world, and it gets refined through the school of hard knocks, or it may be a combination of both academic and practical professional models. But in every case, these models, theories, and processes act as a standardized method to analyze a particular kind of problem frame in a certain way, and it's consistent with the published best practices either of an academic discipline or a professional model that has withstood the test of time. In every case, the use of these models make our investigation systematic, disciplined, and complete. Because here's our problem. We're this little guy over here that's studying the world, and we have a narrow view of that problem area that we defined as a problem frame, and we're looking at it from our lens. But we have all of these blind spots around us, and we can only see that problem area from this side. But what if I was over here looking at it this way, but I don't have that experience, or I don't know that I could even go over there and look. So if we just use our own common sense and our standard way of looking at things, we run the risk of confirmation bias and preconceived notions, the idea that believing is seeing. Well, the entire scientific method and the idea of research is designed to prevent us from becoming a victim of our own blind spots or our own lack of multiple perspectives. So when we adopt these accepted models and methods of research and discipline, what we're really doing is putting on these different glasses in order to look at the problem frame from many different directions. The systematic multiple points of view are baked into the cake when we follow the recipe and we pick an appropriate model for that kind of problem frame, and then we systematically apply it according to the principles that are defined for that method. So when we're doing our data gathering and our data assessment and our lit reviews, we're not just concerned about the content area, the details about the world in that space, but we're also interested in the research process literature that helps us make sure that the lens that we've chosen is appropriate for that problem frame and that we know how to apply it systematically and how to systematically analyze the output. Because once we take a look at this bounded area that we're studying and we've applied this lens, we're going to get some kind of analytical output. And in this case, it might be something like a comparison matrix where we have course of action 1, 2, 3, or 4, and maybe we have criteria A, B, C, and D. And when we we run these courses of action through the scenario that we've developed, and we analyze it in the correct way. We discover that there's some of these courses of action do better than others, and we get some kind of structured analysis output, which then allows us to make justifiable insights or conclusions which we can apply to solving problems. And so we want to make sure then that we are using validated models, that we can rely on the process that we're following to give us legitimate insights about the world. And that helps us make reliable judgments. It helps us overcome the problem of personal blind spots by adopting multiple points of view. It helps us to become consistent and complete in the way we approach difficult problems. And then we can rely on the community of practice to understand what good standards of research and behavior and decision making are, and how to apply them in best practices in the world. So that's the reason that we care about the analytical lens and the model and the theory that it comes from. So some examples of those might be some classical ones like the SWOT analysis, or the application of Porter's 5 forces, or for those of you in Department of Defense, there's a capabilities-based assessment that is a model for how we develop new forces and capabilities in the world. And it looks like, well, you start with a strategic vision or a strategic plan that describes the goals you're trying to achieve, and you conduct a functional area assessment to understand what we have, where we are, and then a functional needs assessment to do a gap analysis to discover where we lack. What we have is short of those goals, and so this tells us what we lack, and then we can analyze those gaps, those deficiencies, to understand how bad is the problem. Green, amber, red, or black is an example of criteria that might be used. Well, green means that, the gap is no problem, or it's a small problem that isn't threatening, or it's a serious problem that we should address, or it is a catastrophic failure unless we do something about it. So you might classify the different gaps that you have in terms of how bad they are. Then that might help you understand your functional solutions analysis to ensure that the possible solutions you're coming up with address the most significant issues or opportunities that you've seen based on your assessment. Well, the functional solutions assessment in that CBA for Department of Defense starts off with an unconstrained list of all possible solutions. And then you go through a series of constraints and limitations based on how much money I have, or the amount of time, or the number of people. And when I apply constraints to this list of possible solutions, I can come up with a set of actionable recommendations that are suitable for solving the problem, that are feasible on the basis of reasonable resource constraints, and are acceptable to all the stakeholders who are affected by the possible solution. So a CBA then is an example of a professional process that can be used to move from a problem or opportunity in the world by framing it, analyzing it systematically, doing some comparisons, and then coming up with professionally accepted standards and practices to come up with suitable, feasible, acceptable solutions. This is kind of a nice structured way to analyze complexity. It's similar in some ways to the SWOT analysis, but it's just another model or a process that overcomes the limitations that we might have as an individual, because it requires you to look at things in a serious way. In the same token, we might use something like the Cotter change model to take that set of recommendations and then structure and sequence the timing of the events to improve the possibilities of successful implementation. So we can use multiple models all along the way. We might implement some cultural models if our solutions or environment featured many different cultures. Or we might have to employ different models and theories of management or personnel rewards, punishment and behavior and organizational dynamics, we might have to pull in a number of other models that help us perform the analysis we need to understand something about this complicated world. And so choosing the analytical lens and making sure that we understand the theories and the models, whether they come from academia or from practical professions, allow us to be consistent, systematic, disciplined, complete, reliable solutions, persuasive to chief decision makers. And when you are adopting a research orientation in order to improve our performance in the world, now understanding who those chief decision makers are and what kind of models and best practices they want to see in order to be confident in the solutions you come up with, it becomes an important part of your research design is to understand who the stakeholders are and what the purpose of your research is actually about. What kind of questions are you answering, and how does it support the delivery of better programs to support the people? So that's what I wanted to say about operating in the world as an advisor to decision makers, public and private, who are looking to you to help them understand why we care about research and what's the big deal with research and why does it matter about the method that we choose to perform the research. Why are we researching it in this way rather than that way? Why should we have trust and confidence in the method that you've chosen? What's the justification for that model being appropriate? How do I know that you applied it correctly? What are the analytical products and insights that come out of using that method? How can I make sense of those findings in order to come up with proposals for action? How do I evaluate those proposals in terms of feasibility and suitability? How do I use something like stakeholder analysis to determine who is likely to be an ally or an enemy when I try to implement this? How can I use something like cultural analysis or the Cotter change model or theories of management and leadership that will help me implement a proposal in the world of people who are going to be having their lives and livelihoods affected by these choices that we make? How can I do that in an organized way? So that's why a research orientation matters, and that's why you, as an advocate for the research orientation, are such an important member of the team in any organization that's trying to get complicated and complex problems solved on behalf of the people. So hopefully this lays out some ideas for you to consider about how we make strategy, how we choose between strategies, how we analyze the strategy for implementation, how we take into account the people that have to put it into practice in order to come up with the best implementation plan, and how we use research to be able to find out if what we did actually is paying off the way we thought it would. That actually helps us understand more about the world and the way it actually works. And if we can be a learning organization, then each time we do this cycle of research and learning and improving, we're getting a better and deeper understanding of the world, which should carry into the next decision that we make and make us better as leaders, managers, and advisors. Okay? So that's what I wanted to cover tonight. And when you see me making comments about the analytical model or lens that you're using in your particular research project, then this is what I'm connecting it to and the kinds of things that I look at. Did you pick a model that seems to be appropriate for the kind of problem that you chose? Are you applying that model in a systematic way? Are the conclusions that you're drawing justified by the data that you gathered? Rather than just a stream of consciousness talking about how I think and what I feel and brainstorming, we're looking to have our insights and methods grounded in the collective wisdom that you find inside the literature about these different methods that we looked at briefly tonight. Okay? So, Thanks very much, and have a great weekend, and looking forward to our continued discussions. Take good care.